so I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Confucian philosophy. In terms of, Marty mentioned the Lampert Feshra, so last time I was here, I talked about the work of Lawrence Lampert. And I would urge you guys to lean on Marty a little bit to get him to talk somewhat about his role in this Feshra. Excellent collection of essays dealing with Plato, Greek guy, Leo Strauss, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And Marty has just a first-rate essay in that collection. It's going to be coming out in just a few weeks. So, anyway, but today I'm going to talk a little bit about Confucius. This is a name that's familiar to everybody. You know him from that famous saying that starts, Confucius say, right? But in fact, Confucian philosophy involves a great deal more than these pithy nuggets of wisdom that are prefaced with that expression. As it turns out, Confucius had a rather elaborate theory of society and the role of its political rulers. Very different way of understanding politics and society than is familiar to us in the West. So in this short talk, I can only scratch the surface of a very, very rich body of thought. But I hope it will be enough to maybe spark your interest and get you thinking. So the Chinese philosopher Confucius, whose years are 551 to 497 BC or BCE, and his Chinese name is Kǒngzǐ. So if you go to China and start talking to people about Confucius, they will have no idea who you're talking about, because that's not the name by which he is known. In Chinese, known as Kǒngzǐ. But for today, he'll be Confucius. And he was born in the state of Lu in the 6th century BCE. His era was one that some might say resembles our own, since it was marked by both political turmoil and what Confucius diagnosed as a state of acute moral decline. Both the political and the moral disorders of a society had a common source, he believed, in the collapse of the authority once exercised by the Zhou dynasty, the ruling family that had come to power nearly 500 years before Confucius was born. So it had once unified China, but its exhaustion had triggered the dissolution of the Chinese polity into a collection of warring feudal states that were all competing for political hegemony. So Confucius his proposed remedy for these disorders was not to lay down a blueprint for a brand new social order, but rather to return to the Tao, or the way. Another word might be familiar to some of you, the Tao. It's a Chinese word, simply means the way, the right way, the natural way. To return to the Tao, or the way, of the early Zhou rulers, whose institutions, rituals, and other practices Confucius regarded as exemplary. He claimed to transmit rather than to innovate, and he urged his students to trust in the ancient ways. The followers of Confucius saw in him the embodiment of a nobler way of life, whose goodness was certified by its antiquity, but whose future was imperiled by modern forces of corruption, or what would have been modern at the time. We think of Confucius as a philosopher, but in his day he was known as another Chinese word that we translate as scholar. And his school of thought was Zhejiang, which is the scholar's school. But or a scholar in ancient China had a somewhat different occupation than its contemporary counterpart. Confucius touted himself as an expert on one, I'm throwing a lot of Chinese words at you, but the reason I do this is because a lot of these Chinese words don't really have precise English language equivalents. But the word one it can be translated as culture, broadly speaking. Culture, along with all of the practices that were regarded as the marks of a civilized human being, such as, at the time, archery, calligraphy, music, and chariot racing. You're a gentleman. Those were the arts that you had mastered. Our culture was, in Confucius' opinion, the glue that holds society together. So, anticipating some of the insights of modern anthropology, he recognized that human beings enter life relatively unformed, and so require, our culture, to give our life shape, and even to help us to become fully human. But while today we like to celebrate the rainbow diversity of cultures in the plural, for Confucius, there was only one culture that really counted, and that was the culture of the early Zhou dynasty. It offered all of the paradigms of proper conduct and the traditions of poetry, music, and dance through which the sensibilities and worldview of this cultural high watermark were passed down. He believed that the health of Chinese civilization depended on deploying the unique power of the Zhou, the dynasty of the Zhou Wen culture, to shape the moral character of Chinese people and to ensure the right ordering of social relationships. But how did Confucius hope to effect this revitalization of Chinese culture? Well, he pinned his hopes on converting local rulers to his way of thinking. For Confucius, one of the most important responsibilities of a ruler was to be the sort of person whom others could admire or emulate. That means that the ruler must embody the virtues of a gentleman. In Chinese, junzi. That's a term, junzi, that originally referred to someone of noble birth, but for Confucius it came to mean anyone whose dispositions and conduct made him worthy of occupying a high social station. So originally it's just a descriptive term, it means son of a prince, right? But for Confucius it came to mean the kind of person who ought to have that high social rank because you have the right kinds of virtues and dispositions. The gentleman, or the junzi, embodies and upholds the cultural ideals and practices on which the health of society depends. A non-gentleman is a shaoren, which literally means a small man, not stature-wise, right? But someone who lacks refinement and is consumed by petty concerns. So what distinguishes the gentleman from the small man, according to Confucius, is that the gentleman understands rightness, whereas the small man understands profit. Stated differently, the gentleman is motivated by the intrinsic satisfactions of moral excellence rather than external rewards, like wealth or sex or acclaim. He seeks opportunities for public service, not out of a desire for luxury or accolades or for fortune or fame, but in order to exercise his virtue to the fullest capacity, like all of you. Admittedly, such a perfect gentleman is rare. Indeed, Confucius is reported to have once said, "I have yet to find a man who loves virtue as much as he loves sex." The business of the state is not just to protect the liberty of its citizens, but above all to promote the sort of virtuous conduct that enables society to function harmoniously. And it's the traditional practices of a culture, what Confucius called its li. Here we have another Chinese word. Li is a word it's often just translated as ritual, sometimes it's translated as propriety, but none of these translations are really adequate. So I'll have to explain a bit what li means for Confucius. But for Confucius, the important thing about Li is that it serves as kind of a school for virtue. So as an expert on culture, Confucius was above all an authority on Li. Li encompasses a broad range of practices and behaviors handed down by tradition to be performed in a socially prescribed and often highly formalized manner. So Li includes much of what we would now place under the heading of morality, but it also includes social etiquette, religious ceremonies, political protocols, and much, much more. In short, all of the things that govern the conduct of a refined human being who has a proper respect for tradition. The chief part of Confucius' recipe for making China great again was to restore the Li, the practices, the rituals of the early Zhou dynasty, believing that it was this set of practices and accompanying moral sensibilities that was ideally suited to foster social harmony, which he thought was sorely lacking in his day. Now, every culture has some sort of Li, some set of ritualized practices that structure the common life of the people within that society. In addition to religious rituals like baptism, bar mitzvahs, and formal prayers, or Pledge of Allegiance, and the rituals that you use kind of structure what you do here. There are innumerable rituals with detailed scripts that we perform to mark ostensibly secular occasions, such as the enthronement of a monarch, or the inauguration of a president, or the opening of a football game. In addition to these well-defined protocols, there are also many less explicitly formalized, but nonetheless well-understood rituals that we expect a civilized person to follow. These include rules prescribing how we should greet our friends, dress for a wedding, an office party, or a funeral, speak to those in authority, give or receive gifts, queue up to see a concert, ask someone to pass the salt, whatever, right? Though some of these rules seem kind of arbitrary, so in China, for instance, courtesy dictates that when you give somebody a gift, or even if you're giving someone your business card, you give it with both hands, and you take it with both hands. If you violate that rule, you're acting in a very rude fashion, and people will be offended. So as the authors of a recent book on ritual observe, ritual is the ornament of life. Ritual brings order and grace, even beauty, to our social interactions. But for Confucius, ritual is more than just ornamentation. It plays a vital role in enabling social life to run harmoniously. It sets expectations that render our interactions more predictable and avert possible sources of conflict. I'll just give you an example. So here's a very common ritual. We don't really think about it, but we all understand it. See how I did that? I moved his hand through the power of my mind. I'll do it again. So that's a ritual, right? And you do that, and you establish, that we're friends. I'm pleased to meet you. I have goodwill towards you, and it says a lot without my actually having to say it. If I were to actually say that, it'd probably sound kind of weird. It may be insincere, right? Right? But rituals can sometimes go wrong. So here, shake my hand. Right, and now there's a kind of awkwardness, between us. So this is just an example. It's not Confucius's example, but I think it makes his point about the importance of these rituals in daily life, and how when we violate the rituals, things start to go wrong. So from a Confucian point of view, it's significant that many of our rituals dictate treating people differently based on their social rank relative to us. So in this way, the ritual helps to maintain the social hierarchies that Confucius believes are vital to maintaining order in society. I'll give you another example. When I was in China teaching, and one of my students invited me to her birthday party. And it was held at a restaurant. They had a private room like this, but it's a big round table, and everybody's sharing the same food, order, individual entrees. So anyway, I'm there, and I'm actually the only adult person. Everyone else is a young woman, college age, right? So I'm sitting there and I'm talking to this young woman next to me, and I'm just really caught up in the conversation, and food starts being brought to the table. And because, in China, they don't bring all the food at once. As soon as it's prepared in the kitchen, they bring it out, put it on your table, right? And so there's maybe 2 or 3 dishes on the table. I haven't started eating yet. And I look around the table, and no one is eating. Why is that? Because I haven't started eating. Right? Because I am the elder, I'm the teacher, I'm the laoshe, right? I'm the high-ranking individual at this gathering, and these are, polite young women who just, it would be impossible for them to start eating until I did, right? So that was a little embarrassing when I realized I was delaying everybody's, dinner, but anyway, so that's an example of a kind of ritual. It's not our ritual here, right? Here, everybody dies for the food at once. Knock grandma and grandpa out of the way. But it's a little bit different than in China, and it is one way in which this idea of social hierarchy, social rank, is actually kind of embodied in everyday practices. And again, this is, mismanaging these little rituals can create big problems. So from a Confucian perspective, properly performed ritual, again, the Chinese word is li, and it has a much broader sense than our word ritual, but we'll just use that word. Properly performed ritual does more than just establish us in a harmonious relationship to others. It also has the power to transform us collectively and individually. And it's in considering how this occurs that we encounter some of Confucianism's deepest reflections on the nature of human beings and society. So Confucius compared the work of self-cultivation, through which you become a gentleman. You're not born a gentleman. You have to apply yourself to that. And Confucius compares that to the lapidary arts, to cutting and polishing ivory, or carving and grinding jade. Right? These are arduous but delicate processes through which initially rough, raw materials are shaped into something beautiful. So this metaphor implies a rather unflattering view of human nature in its original state, coupled with a highly optimistic view of what human nature can become if worked upon properly. It was one of Confucius' successors, the philosopher Kǒngzǐ, who most fully explored the role of li in this process. The starting point for Kǒngzǐ is the originally boundless nature of human desires, the absence of any limits, any natural limits on the human appetite for profit and pleasure, as well as our natural animosity towards anyone who thwarts us in our efforts to satisfy our desires. So consequently, our default state is to be a Shaolin, right? Shaolin means a small man, a small person. And if everyone were to simply follow his or her natural inclinations, the world would be beset with violence and disorder. So for Confucius, rulers have a special responsibility to uphold Li, ritual propriety, since they will invariably be looked up to as models. It is incumbent that the ruler conduct himself at all times with the utmost dignity and decorum, exhibiting the most conscientious Li in recognition of the grave responsibilities that come with an office in which one's every word and gesture sounds a message to one's subjects. Others look to the ruler as a role model, so his actions will set the tone for society as a whole, for better or for worse. But just as importantly, the decorum of the ruler elicits people's respect for the office and the man who occupies it, which Confucius believes is crucial to the maintenance of the social order and the hierarchies that buttress it. Right? So, as you probably know, traditional Chinese society is very, very hierarchical, right? But the hierarchy isn't maintained just by people on the upper ranks being tyrannical, right? It's maintained by the people on the upper ranks behaving in such a way that they elicit the spontaneous respect of the people who they're governing. If those above love Li, love ritual, Confucius is reported to have said, then the common people will be easy to manage. Without the respect fostered by Li, however, the ruler has no choice but to resort to coercive measures to maintain his power in the social order he upholds. For Confucius, the ideal is to rule through another Greek word, wu-wei, which is a term that literally means doing nothing, but might more felicitously be translated as not forcing, taking it easy, to quote my not favorite band, the Eagles. So Confucius asks, and here he's referring to one of the famous sage emperors of the past. He says, was not Shun one who ruled by means of wu-wei? What did he do? He made himself reverent and took his ritual position facing south. That's all. He just sat there being regal. No doubt this account wildly exaggerates the power of ritual, but the point is nonetheless valid. A social order governed by the transformational power of ritual is the best, or even, from a Confucius perspective, the only alternative to the regime of violence. Confucius contrasts rule through coercion and violence with rule through virtue, or in Chinese, that sounds silly, doesn't sound like Homer Simpson, but it's actually, it means virtue. It's usually translated as virtue. But it has nuances of meaning that go beyond what is ordinarily denoted by our English word. Like virtue, is used by Confucius to refer to a moral quality, but it also signifies a mysterious inner potency or personal charisma that exercises an almost preternatural sway over those who fall within its compass, changing their hearts and minds for the better. One who rules through the power of virtue, reports Confucius, is analogous to the pole star. It simply remains in place and receives the homage of the myriad lesser stars. In a famous passage, Confucius likens the of the noble individual, the gentleman, to the wind, while the small man, or the shaman, is like the grass. And when the wind blows over the grass is sure to bend. And the implication here is kind of this moral force, this moral influence. Although Confucius describes the as an almost magical force, the underlying idea is that the political leaders set the tone for the rest of society. And people will act accordingly. In modern society, we often look to celebrities, entertainers, actors, sports figures, even reality TV stars, as models of what we should desire, how we should speak and act, what constitutes a good life. In Confucius' day, and no doubt to a great extent in our own day as well, political leaders were the models that everybody aspired to emulate, since they were the most visible and prominent members of society. Consequently, when an official asked Confucius what could be done about the alarming number of robbers in his state, Confucius replied, "If you could just get rid of your own excessive desires, the people would not steal, even if you rewarded them for it." By coveting luxury items for himself, this official was infecting the people with his own desire for opulence, and whether intending to or not, encouraging them to value money more than virtue, and to act outside the law in order to satisfy the desire that their ruler had inflamed in them. By contrast, the positive force of the is the charisma, the mimetic charisma of the gentleman, whose kindness and rectitude Confucius hoped would have a cascading effect that could affect a moral revival in society at large. Through the power of his virtue, the virtuous ruler brings about a degree and depth of social harmony that could never be accomplished by mere acts of legislation. Therefore, the primary responsibility of the ruler, besides attending to the material well-being of his people, is to cultivate and display his charismatic his virtue. Well, it's been a while since we've seen such a ruler here in our country, if we ever have. But some people think that Confucius' theories offer at least a partial explanation of why our society is experiencing so much disorder. Without the virtuous gentleman steering the ship of state, it's the small man who sets the tone of society, with consequences that Confucius believes are potentially calamitous. That's it. Thank you.